We are going to talk about certain perspectives of Sigmund Freud, the founder of so-called psychoanalysis. But before that, do you have any questions again regarding our earlier discussions? You want me to continue with Lukács, but it's over now. Okay, any questions? No questions. Do I have something in my mind to tell you about Nietzsche? Perhaps some concluding remarks? Let me think. There were one or two points in my mind when I left the class last time, but I don't remember them right now. Okay, then Sigmund Freud, the second of the three bastards of Western thinking, actually. Okay. They are so called in the literature, not me calling them as bastards. Okay.
Yeah, why the other two? Why the other two?
The other two was, the first one was Marx, then Nietzsche, then Freud. These three bastards of Western thinking, Western tradition. Okay. The last one. Actually, the last one make it quite clear what the others already beginning to talk about. Okay, the unconscious. It's a strange phenomenon simply because actually the very possibility of its existence somehow defies a logic. You know, first of all, as the name already indicates, this turns out to be quite problematic, you know. Up until now we were talking about consciousness. Understood as the state of our being aware. Now, from this state of our being aware, whether it's an act, whether it's a structure, whatever, does not make much difference, okay? From this, now we are going to talk about the unconscious, something about which we are not aware, actually. Okay? How come? Do you see a certain problem over there? Actually, Freud himself confesses that psychoanalysts do not know what unconscious is. Nobody knows, actually, okay, what unconscious is. But he says that out of certain symptoms, the psychoanalyst can infer the existence of the unconscious. Okay? Otherwise, you wouldn't think that through somebody is having a method here, a special method here that would enable this consciousness to approach to what it is not, actually. Okay. No, it's not. There are certain symptoms indicating themselves, showing themselves in consciousness, and therefore these symptoms actually pointing to a certain inconsistency, and therefore some trouble for the smooth operating system of consciousness, and therefore the psychoanalyst can infer the existence of another apparatus laying behind consciousness, which they term as unconscious. Okay, it's quite ontologically actually setting very serious and important problems, especially for if you think Hegelian thinking, where everything, the whole of existence, was based upon spirit, and the whole development of spirit was understood as spirit's coming to know itself in the absolute sense of the term. Okay, you would recognize that the very possibility of unconscious creates a very serious problem of this coming to know of its own self. Okay? So Freud started his studies. Actually, let me make certain remarks before entering the discussion of his theories. First of all, up until recent years, as some of you are familiar with the fact, psychoanalysis has not been accepted as a legitimate field of study, neither by psychology nor psychiatry. Psychiatry being based upon the medical treatment of the patients, okay, so it found its existence within the larger body of the science of medicine, and in this contrast, kind of science of mind. How you define psychology, anyway? Is there any student here having psychology courses? No. Nobody. So what do you think psychology is? And the neighboring departments, you know.
Study of the human behaviors and thoughts.
Can we say so? I don't know. I don't know. Is there anybody who can help us here?
Study of the human mind.
Yeah, perhaps. Study of the human mind from a certain perspective, perhaps. And study of human behavior as well. Again, from a certain... so here comes somebody that I know is making a double major, was it, right? In sociology and psychology.
Yes.
So I was asking what psychology is.
You were asking about psychology. Yeah. I think I'm the last person to ask.
I don't know. You have taken several psychology courses, so you may have a better idea than us.
Well, science of soul, maybe.
Science of soul. Do they stick still to the idea of soul?
No.
So, science of what then?
Kind of mind, I can say.
Science of mind. Science of mind. So why do you think psychology assumes a rejecting attitude against psychoanalysis?
Because of positivist approach, I think. Yeah, because you cannot observe soul or unconscious. So, but you can easily observe and measure and predict behaviors that you can see. So.
So the two definitions we have taken from the students seem to be correct, right? Study of human behavior and study of human mind, they seem to be both correct for psychology. So psychologists think that or claim that they are studying the structure or the operations, functioning of the human mind,
Yeah, all of them.
and the formation of the human behavior in connection with this. Okay, I guess this is a rough definition of psychology. And as we hear from our friend, psychology does not like psychoanalysis simply because it does not based upon, in its methodology at least, right? It is not based upon what? Upon what? Empirical facts. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, however, when I try to think about Freud, I see that he has got his education in medicine. He's a physician, doctor, you know. And then he concentrated on the study of the human mind, okay? So took certain courses from within psychology, and then he began to clinic work, okay? And actually his pursuit was to establish a certain field of science. He was a scientist. He was not rejecting science, on the contrary, up until to the end, as far as my readings of him go, actually. Up to the end, he stick to the requirement of the empirical facts, okay, observation. Okay, he was sometimes quite free to develop theories which you may call speculative, but was always ready to modify or change them. Okay? Never stick to the theories. Actually, he developed theories in the forms of hypotheses to be modified when the empirical evidence necessitated it. Okay, so actually, if you read them, actually this is the aspect that I most appreciate in his writings. Okay, he proposes certain important theories, but at the same time shows his readiness to change them, to modify them. Okay, if I can find, I can make certain quotations from some of his writings. Okay, short rather quotations. So he started as a medicine man, presumably to be working on, if he did not insist on his views, working on in the field of psychiatry, not even in psychology. Then passed through a stage of psychology, so to speak, culminating in developing another field, another science. He claimed that psychoanalysis is another science, is a different science. Okay, and he felt himself as destined. Actually, he says that, okay, as destined to pursue the requirements of this science. Okay. Now, what are the basics of this science? Okay. From very beginning to the end, okay, we have said that Freud changed these views quite often, and actually scholars were able to distinguish 3 or 4 distinct phases of his theoretical work, okay. But there were certain elements that remained constant from very beginning to the end as well, okay. Yeah. You could imagine that, first of all, the existence of a mental apparatus, for instance, okay? Whatever you call it. Now, for the time being, we are calling it as mental apparatus simply because, as you'll see, consciousness would turn out to be only one factor in this mental apparatus, in the structure of mental apparatus. Okay? So that mental apparatus displays certain regularities, was the second hypothesis, if you like. Okay, it displays certain regularities. Now, of course, for a physician, or for a psychiatrist, for a psychologist, or a psychoanalyst, to be able to, being able to come across with a patient, each one of them call this factor of the patient, the other person, displaying some problems, or if you like, some symptoms. Okay. It would not be possible to conduct any study, without coming across with that somebody having certain problems. Okay. So you can imagine that the basic knowledge generated in this field has been driven from those people complaining about certain symptoms. Okay. Otherwise, you wouldn't know who they are, and you wouldn't be able to study them. They wouldn't come to you. Okay, they wouldn't come to you, and you were never able to know whether there are such persons or not. But this as well, Freud will point out this as well creates a certain danger of bias at the same time. If you are going to develop a theory of mind or mental apparatus out of this data, you would have certain problems. Why? Because you are working on the mental apparatuses which are rather problematic, not normal. Okay? For instance, Freud's earlier case, hysterics. People complaining about unforeseen mental attacks or psychic attacks which cannot directly be linked to any experience they were having in their lives. Okay? So this early phase, which stretched from 1886 to 1897, when Freud come back from France, from his studies in France to Germany, and start to work in the hospital, okay? Actually, at the end of the 19th century, 1886 to 1897, okay? Of course, he began to develop certain theories out of the work conducted on the hysterics, okay? And he found out that in these studies, in these works with the hysterics, he found out that in the childhood of these persons, there had been a certain phenomenon which had been taken as a trauma, in displaying traumatic effects, but nevertheless, Freud would call it repressed, forgotten, but yet kept in their unconsciousness. Okay, therefore, it's much more appropriate to call them repressed. Now causing certain symptoms in the lives of these individuals. Okay, it's quite an understandable theory. Actually, this phrase of his theoretical thinking is usually called as the seductive theory or seductive period. Okay. Some event there takes place in my childhood. Somebody does something to me, and therefore in my adult life I began to develop these or those symptoms. Okay. Some kind of displaying some kind of psychic disturbances. Okay. Now, however, as you can imagine, there are several problems with it. Okay, when Freud began to observe people without symptoms, he came to discover that similar events can also be observed in the early life of these adult persons as well. Say, for instance, what can we say, for instance, an early experience of sexual harassment by the adults in the family, for instance. Or something else, okay? Creating an effect on the young child, but later on forgotten, actually expressed in psychoanalytic terms, repressed into the structure of consciousness. So it is no longer remembered, means it is no longer in the conscious, but that it is no longer in the conscious does not mean that it disappeared altogether, okay? Rather, it is repressed onto another kind of, if you like, existence where it is kept in the unconscious, okay? So consciousness, without knowing about its existence, okay, on the one hand, trying to manage the life of the individual, while that repressed element, okay, showing its effects on the actual behavior of the individual there, okay, without that individual's willing, him or herself as well. Okay. But as I told you, it's a very beautiful story, you know, some early childhood experience causing me to act in this or that way without my knowing about it. So psychoanalysis can help me to remember to that event, okay, and bring, as we have discussed yesterday or a couple of days ago, okay, as we have discussed, okay, not only remember, but to organize the experience into a new form by allowing me to rewrite my own history, okay? Now, helping me to reconcile with that, whatever it was, let's call it for the time being, trauma, okay? Reconcile with the trauma in my consciousness and then get over with the symptoms, okay? So this was the purpose of the cure, treatment, whatever you like to call it. And psychoanalysis was promising to help you in that regard, okay? To bring into the light of consciousness what has been repressed in the early childhood, okay? But the problem was that, as I said, let's assume that the X event taking place in the early childhood period of the person, okay? We are now saying that causes, establishing a causal relationship, causes the rise of a certain symptom, say beta, okay, in the adult individual. But there's a problem here simply because observation tells Freud that that event as X did indeed occur in the early childhood of many people, okay, but without generating the symptom beta, okay? So how are we going to resolve this? Actually, when Freud realizes this, this is a very interesting section. I hope it is this quotation. Yeah, he says that I cannot admit that earlier in my work, I exaggerated the frequency or importance of that influence, the influence of the event. So I did not then know that persons who remain normal may have had the same experiences in their childhood. Okay, and though I consequently overrated the importance of seduction in comparison with the factors of sexual constitution and development. Obviously, seduction is not required in order to arouse a child's sexual life. That can also come about spontaneously from internal causes. Somewhere else, he also says that when I realized this, actually, I thought that all my theoretical efforts had been collapsed, okay? And he feels himself quite demoralized on that ground. Okay. Simply because if the situation, if the case is that, okay, and if you are not be able to find another solution to be explain away the difficulty, okay, it means that there is no meaning in psychoanalysis, no meaning in psychology either. Okay, I don't know about psychiatry, but no meaning in psychoanalysis or no meaning in psychology either, simply because what we have here is a failure to establish, okay, an internal event and external symptom, a relationship between an internal event and external symptom, okay. So, do we have any suggestion as to overcome this difficulty?
Maybe retroactive causality.
Yeah, we can skip out the option of causality, but what then? What remains then? Nothing, actually. If you take away the idea of causality out of the sciences, for instance, we say that sociology is not a science aiming at causal explanations, but rather what? Apart from causation, what kind of explanation do you know?
Actually, I mean, it's not the past that causes one to fall ill. On the contrary, it is now that causes you to change your past in history in such a way. That's why not all the persons that are experiencing the event X develops the symptom beta. That's the explanation for
The contemporary reinterpretation causes the event as to show itself as the primary reason for your having symptoms.
Actually, in this case, Wolfgang and Freud gave an explanation closer to psyche.
Okay, this is an interesting explanation actually. I'd rather prefer this one than the Freudian explanation perhaps, okay? But his explanation was something else. His explanation was actually, he came close to this, as far as I know. Of course, a better interpreter of Freud may say something else. But as far as I know, he came close to this, an understanding and appreciation of this problem in his interpretation of dreams. In the interpretation of dreams, in the analysis of dreams, he came to recognize that there are internal forces, psychic forces, already operating in the individual. And the formation of a past event in the form of a trauma here owes its traumatic character not to itself alone, but in its connection to these psychic forces in the individual's mental apparatus, so to speak. Okay? So actually this comes to mean that later on develop into a theory of sexuality. This comes to mean that the psychic apparatus or the life of the individual is not a passive agent here. Okay? It's rather an active agent. Let me reread once again at least one sentence from the quotation I read you already. Okay? I consequently overrated the importance of seduction in comparison with the factors of sexual constitution and development. Obviously, seduction is not required in order to arouse a child's sexual life. Okay? So here there are two factors. On the one hand, we are talking about a seductive event, seduction. On the other hand, child's sexual life. And Freud here in this quotation tells us that he came to realize that for a child's sexual life to be aroused, okay, it's not necessary that there must have been a seduction or seductive event. Okay? That's the critical. So child's sexual life, sexual feelings or sexual libido is already there. Now, this theory later on will be quite infamous, actually, simply because, yeah, man, what are you saying, man? Yeah, we are talking about that innocent child over there, okay? Yeah, that innocent child, that helpless creature, which is totally subject to the doings of the adults. Now, Freud, in contrast to this, Freud was saying that, no, the child is an active agent, okay? The child is an active agent, and an active agent which can quite be dangerous, okay? Far from being innocent. Innocence has nothing to do with the child's existence, okay? The child is a sexual agent, and dangerous sexual agent simply because the child does not have restrictions as the adults do have, okay? So, yeah, in contrast to the existence, if you like, material existence of the seductive event in childhood, okay, what psychoanalysis from then on should try to look at is the relationship with between a particular event and the sexual energy, the forms of sexual energy inside the individual psyche or mental apparatus, whatever you like to take it. Okay, there was an interesting, actually, contribution, and you know, this as well brings us to a certain difficulty in psychoanalysis, and most of the time, actually, I did take that certain criticism against psychoanalysis seriously. That actually, there's another alternative to this as well, because after several clinic experiences, Freud and probably other psychoanalysts as well can easily find out that patients or analysants, as they prefer to call them, okay, or the individuals under the, how can I put it, pressure, if you like, or if you like, suggestion, or if you like, incitement, encouragement of the psychoanalytic procedure, came to invent, if you like, a non-existent traumatic event in their childhood as well. Okay. Now, this has been set against psychoanalysis, as I told you, as a serious critique, simply because psychoanalysis requires that their analysants would acquire a certain knowledge of psychoanalysis and came to be able to practice that analysis by themselves. Okay? In other words, the process of analysis is also a process of teaching, okay, and learning, and therefore, for both of the parties, for both the analyst and the analysant, and therefore, in the process, actually, the analysant turns out to be a self-analyst at the same time. Now, but self-analyst decorated with all those theories of conscious, unconscious, drives, repression, etc., etc., okay, now come to interpret each and every memory, each and every piece and parcel of memory. Sometimes these pieces are invented. Actually, they are not there, but they are required and therefore produced at the spur of the moment to be able to solve a certain difficulty. Okay, so the conclusion is that if I'm displaying such kind of symptoms, okay, then I should have necessarily such kind of trauma, whether that trauma depends upon actual event or not. Okay. Now we have modified our understanding of trauma. Rather than the actual event itself, for instance, sexual harassment by an adult, by a parent in the family, okay? Now we shift the emphasis to the interpretation, to the taking in, specific taking in of that particular event by a particular individual, okay? So how are you going to take that particular event of your parents acting this or that way? Turns out to be the major problem. In other words, the relationship of my inner dynamics, my inner energy, or the flow of my inner libido, and that external stimuli, okay? Not the external stimuli no longer, but this relationship turns out to be the traumatic one, okay? Not that my father did this to me, but rather when I was feeling this and that and that my father did this to me, turns out to be, makes that event a traumatic event, okay? However, even though there may not be such a case, as you can see now, when I began to interpret not only the event, the only way of interpreting the event is, by the way, is in accord with the social standards, okay? That your parents did, your father did sexually harass you, for instance. According to what? How are you going to determine what harassment is, sexual harassment is, okay? What an incestuous relationship is, for instance. There are no standards, sorry, no universal standards. The only remaining referential point, the social standards. How the society in which you live accepts, sees it, okay? That your father take you in his lap and rubbed your legs, for instance. Is that a case of sexual harassment or not? There is no absolute criteria, okay? It depends upon the social norm, how the individuals in that society accept and internalize that social norm, and how they feel themselves obliged to act in accordance with that social norm, okay? Otherwise, there's no universal standard. So, an event, therefore, can never be a traumatic event in itself. Okay, fine. But so that to be able to determine the traumatic character of the event, then I refer to the social standards. But here in the second approach, it's not enough even then, simply because what has been emphasized is not the event itself, but is how the internal libidinal structure of the individual interacts with that event. Okay? So, which means that each and every case of what's socially defined as sexual harassment may not cause symptomatic adult life. Okay? Fine. Adding to this, the other difficulty that the analysant usually tends to produce the necessary experience and necessary connection under the suggestion of psychoanalysis as well. You know, come on, man. Yani if I'm having these symptoms, and there gotta be something. And I'm taking a look into my inside and find that there are energies trying to come out of me, and now how am I going to resolve this? I'm not able to find out that connection. Let's produce one, okay? So, this last difficulty remains as a critique even today for psychoanalysis, okay? What would I like to say? I'd like to make okay, a beautiful extract again in connection with this, okay? When, however, Freud says, I was at last obliged to recognize that, he was not so much willing to recognize, that these scenes of seduction had never taken place, and that they were only fantasies. This part, fantasies part, is important. They were only fantasies which my patients had made up or which I myself had perhaps forced on them. Now he's talking about these two problems. Okay? I was for a time completely at a loss. My confidence alike in my technique and its results suffered a severe blow. It could not be disputed that I had arrived at these scenes by a technical method which I considered correct, and their subject matter was unquestionably related to the symptoms from which my investigation had started. When I had pulled myself together, I was able to draw the right conclusions from my discovery. Namely that the neurotic symptoms were not related directly to actual events, but to wishful fantasies, and that as far as the neurosis was concerned, psychical reality was of more importance than material reality. Okay? I do not believe in now that I forced the seduction fantasies on my patients, that I suggested them. I had in fact stumbled for the first time upon the Oedipus complex, which was later to assume such an overwhelming importance, but which I did not recognize in its disguise of fantasy. Okay. So here we are talking about the sexual arousal of, or the arousal of the sexual energy in the child as early as that phase, okay? And then we are talking about the development of fantasies during childhood, early childhood in the individuals. And Freud says that he did not recognize the natural, true character of these fantasies, which hid from his understanding the Oedipal complex. Okay. Okay, the Oedipal complex. With this, I guess we arrive at the end of the seduction theory period and start what's called beginning of the what's called topographical phase. Freud himself calls it as topographical model. Okay, he develops a certain topographical model of human mental apparatus for what? Yeah, we were discussed this a couple of days ago. there is a difficulty in psychoanalysis, okay? That difficulty is this. On the one hand, it tries to solve the problems of the individuals, okay? Tries to cure you, okay? Yeah, it tries to help you to get rid of your symptoms on the one hand. And on the other hand, tries to develop the scientific knowledge of the mental apparatus. You know, you may see this as the unity of what it is, unity of science and technology in a way. Okay, unity of science and technology, which is expected to go in a rather smooth fashion, you may think. Well, you know, the relationship between science and technology is quite a problematic one. While technology concentrates on the issue of solving the problems which are here and now facing us, okay, science aims at arriving the truth of the things, okay? And these two different aims may not always and all the time reconcile and go hand in hand with each other. And sometimes, perhaps even worse, most of the times, okay, they try to impede each other. Okay? That's the problem. And psychoanalysis finds itself in this tenuous relationship between producing the knowledge of the truth of the mental apparatus on the one hand and offering help to the suffering individual on the other hand. Okay? And actually, up until now, this tenuous relationship has not been resolved. Simply because especially in psychoanalysis, which can be very dangerous, especially in psychoanalysis, if you concentrate on the problem of truth, okay, you may miss to help the suffering individual. Okay, seductive phase ends up, and what he calls a topographic phase starts actually from 1897 up until 1923. Okay, before entering into this, let's have a break, and we will continue after that.